Hello, and welcome to Chapter 22, discussion on the um, immune system. All right, this is kind of a follow up to 21. 21 talked about the lymphatic system as as a functional entity, sort of as what were the components of it, how did it run, how did it work. This time we're talking about the cells and how it works on a cellular level. All right, so this is really the immune system, and it obviously it's part of the lymphatic. Um, but this time we're just looking at the immune cells. Lymphatic system, chapter 21, looked at the lymph itself and all the processes and the organs of it and how the fluid flows and things like that. Here we're going to talk more specifically about what are the components of the immune system and how do they work. All right. So first I'm going to start with a little discussion about what are things that cause disease? Now, this is something that you'll learn about too if you take microbiology, which I teach too, and we spend the whole class talking about these things. Well, not really, but anyway, I don't want to get into that. But here we're going to talk about what are the things that cause disease. And the types of organisms that cause disease are basically in five major categories, as we see here: bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoans, and multicellular parasites. We refer to them mostly as helminths or worms in microbiology. There actually is one more category, and that is algae. But algae do not. It's very rare, and only in very few very people have there been algal infections. So we don't put that one in there. But that's the only thing that also is out there as a category, as a well, archaea as well, but and very few of those cause disease. But so these ones are the ones that primarily cause disease: bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoans, and other kinds of parasites, largely worms. Bacteria are the prokaryotes. They're extremely small as compared to the cells of our body. They have a cell membrane and a cell wall. They have various shapes, spherical, rod-like, or coiled. So you might see these referring to specific things that are diseases. So like streptococcus, so a cocci, bacillus anthracis causes anthrax, streptococcus pneumonia causes pneumonia, causes respiratory diseases, and so on, staphylococcus. But the vast majority of bacteria that there are harmless, don't have any effect on us. Those that are disease causing are called virulent. So virulent bacteria may have pili, capsule, release toxins. Um, One way or another, their metabolism or their presence somehow causes a disease. Um, Viruses are even tinier things. These are so tiny you can't see them with a light microscope. You have to go to an electron microscope to see these. Most of them, the largest ones, might show up barely. Um, Viruses are essentially just pieces of DNA or RNA that are wrapped together with some enzymes in a protein shell, and they may or may not have a lipid membrane around, not membrane, they call it an envelope, but a lipid layer around it as well. And this is all it is. For a while, and they were not even categorizing it as a living thing because it doesn't have all the properties, but it does have most of the properties if we consider the fact that its time with metabolism is when it is an intracellular parasite. So it's an obligate intracellular parasite. So what a virus does is it binds onto the surface of a cell, the host cell, injects its interior, its DNA, RNA, and the enzymes that are going to accompany those into the cell, and they make their way into the genome, copy the DNA or RNA using the machinery, using the structures of the cell, and they make more of themselves. They make more DNA or RNA, and they make the proteins that make up the virus and send new virus particles off on their way. So virus must enter the cell to reproduce. The virus or immune response may kill the host, and they directly infect the cell, and the cell makes copies of the protein, the virus. Fungi are eukaryotic cells, as are we eukaryotic cells, with a membrane and a cell wall. These include the mold yeasts, proteolytic enzymes release proteolytic enzymes, induce inflammation, cause superficial diseases in the integument, may infect mucosal linings. A lot of times, fungal infections are only in immunocompromised people, but not always, of course. Athlete's foot is one, but it stays in the skin. And there can be deadly fungal diseases as well. Protozoans are the one-celled animals, as they're typically called too. These are eukaryotic cells like the fungi, and like us, our cells are eukaryotic, meaning they have a nucleus and other organelles. But protozoans don't have a cell wall. They can be parasites, and they can live inside or outside of a cell. Malaria, trichomoniasis are examples of protozoan diseases. And multicellular parasites are more non-microscopic. They can be seen without the aid of a microscope. And then there's also prions. Prions are fragments of infectious protein. So a prion is an infectious protein. An unusual thing. This infectious protein gets in the cell, and it actually didn't come with its own DNA or RNA. So it rearranges the DNA or RNA that's there to make more of itself. And also the protein can break into pieces, and each one of those does something to the cell. For the most part, the prion diseases really are of the brain, which is kind of unusual. Something called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, which is kind of similar to man-cow disease in cows. Yeah, and it's still even looked at if Alzheimer's might be caused by something like that. So immune cells and their location. So those are the things that we're going to look at, and mention as we go along as infectious agents, infectious things, infectious invaders. So here, as we're looking at immune cells, we are looking at leukocytes. Remember, we learned about those when we learned about the blood. Come from the red bone marrow. They include the granulocytes, which are the neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. Called that because when you look at them when they're dyed, they show little granules of substance in them. And then there's the monocytes, become macrophages when they leave the blood and enter tissues. Lymphocytes, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, and natural killer cells, so B cells, T cells, and NK cells. So a lot of the leukocytes, you find them in body tissues rather than cruising around in the blood. The blood is just a means for them to get around. We talked a little bit about the secondary and primary lymphatic structures in the last chapter. So the secondary lymphatic structures are what houses the T and B lymphocytes, macrophages, dendritic cells, natural killer cells. Find these in the lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, malt, lymphatic nodules. So we find these in the nodules, if you remember. And the nodules we find in the lymph nodes and the malt and the tonsils and that. They're not really nodules in the spleen, though. These TB cells are not like in nodules, but all the other ones they are. All the other lymphatic tissues they are. So again, like I said, select organs house macrophages. Some organs of some tissues, some systems have their own macrophages that cruise around. Um, so like the microglia in the neuroglia of the um, nervous system, right? And there's other ones that we'll look at too as we go. The lungs do. They kind of just cruise around the lungs. Alveolar macrophages like that. Epithelial layers of skin and mucosal membranes house the dendritic cells. There are cells derived from monocytes. The dendritic cells are phagocytic. They engulf pathogens and bring them into the lymph system. Connective tissues have mast cells. Mast cells are part of the inflammatory response. They're important in the inflammatory response. So the immune cells are kind of all over the body. Different kinds of the immune cells are all over the body. And primary locations of the immune cells, like we say, since they're blood cells, find them in the blood, the lymph, the lungs, spleen, right? Uh, and other kinds of tissues too, like connective tissues. So looking at chemical messengers, cytokines, small proteins regulate immune activity, produced by cells both innate and adaptive immune systems, which we'll talk about those in a minute. So like I say, they're chemical messengers. They have the effects of signaling cells, controlling development behavior, and also targeting cells for destruction. So this begs the next part is there's two types of immunity when we're looking at these cells. We have an innate immunity and an adaptive immunity. The innate immunity is something that simply exists. So something that's innate means it comes with it, like parts of a car or something. Um, so the cells are involved, the specificity of cell response. These things are going to be different for the innate versus adaptive. Adaptive, as the name implies, is part of the immune system that has adapted. It has matured. It has altered itself to be able to target specific pathogens. This is how we get immunized. How we get immunity from being immunized is the adaptive immunity. Okay, like the innate immunity, as it says, present at birth, protects against a variety of things. So part of the innate immunity are all those things can that can and do protect us from infection. That includes barriers like skin and mucous membranes, um, cellular defenses, so defenses in the cell like lysosomes, and then outside the cell. All right, um, all these are innate immunities, and then adaptive immunity is one that has been acquired, and like I say, it's a specific. It's adapted to this to give us that immunity. So this involves the T cells and the B cells, the T lymphocytes and the B lymphocytes. And this can take days to maybe even weeks to be effective. And like I said, um, this is where we get our immunity from our immunizations. So when we look at these, we see the adaptive versus the immune response, adaptive versus, innate. Um, so we got the innate barriers, and then we got internal defenses, cells, chemicals, adaptive lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes produce antibodies. T lymphocytes, the cell mediated, the cell actually goes around and kills things, goes after things, attacks them. Okay. Okay, so let's first look at the innate immunity. And this is kind of a long chapter and stuff. So actually, I'm going to split this up here. I'm going to stop this here. And part two, we'll look at the innate versus acquired or adaptive immunity.